In the 13 December 2022 state election, the National Alliance won 14 out of 15 seats, and Haji Rafa from the religious party RP was appointed Menteri Besar on 15 December 2022. On 23 December 2025, 8 assemblymen withdrew their support for him, including 3 members from RP, whose party membership was terminated the next day. On 25 December, Haji Rafa then requested the Sultan to dissolve the assembly, but failed as he was denied entry into the palace due to public holiday. On 26 December at 6 a.m., the Sultan then appointed Mr. Elvis as the new Menteri Besar, claiming that he had majority support. Later that day, at 4 p.m., the Speaker declared the casual vacancy for the 3 seats vacant due to the expelled RP members. Haji Rafa then argues that he remains the lawful Menteri Besar since he never resigned or was dismissed, and claims that Mr. Elvis lacks majority support, while Mr. Elvis maintains his appointment is valid since he has the majority support and within the Sultan's discretion. So for the first main issue is whether Haji Rafa's dismissal from the office of Menteri Besar was constitutionally valid. More specifically, we are going to focus on the key question, whether he had ceased to command the confidence of the majority of the State Legislative Assembly. Under Section 2, Subsection 2, Paragraph A of the 8th Schedule, the Sultan has the constitutional power to appoint a Menteri Besar from one of the members of the Legislative Assembly, who in his judgment is likely to command the confidence of the majority. So, from the very beginning, the legitimacy of a Menteri Besar will depend on the majority support in the Assembly. It was also clearly explained in the case of Datuk Sri Neza Najamaluddin and Datuk Sri Datuk Zamri Abdul Qadir. In this case, Pakatan Raya in Perak had won by a very slim majority, and Neza was then appointed as the Menteri Besar. Later on, 3 assemblymen had withdrew their support from him and switched to Barisan Nasional. Because of this, Neza then requested for dissolution of the State Assembly from the Sultan, but it was then rejected. The Sultan then met the assemblymen who had changed side and was satisfied that Neza no longer had the support of the majority, even though there was no formal vote in the assembly. Neza then was asked to resign, but he refused. The court later decided that Menteri Besar can lose the confidence of the majority even without a formal vote of non-confidence, and the Sultan is allowed to rely on extrinsic evidence, which is in this case was the statutory declarations by the assemblymen to determine that the Menteri Besar had lost majority confidence. Now, applying that principle to the present scenario, the Sultan received 8 statutory declarations from members of the SLA to withdraw their support for Haji Rafa that consisted of 3 declarations from the religious party and 5 from the Unity party. In a house of 15 seats, 8 clearly constitutes a simple majority, so this alone is sufficient to demonstrate that Haji Rafa no longer commanded the confidence of the majority, even without a formal sitting or vote, which is consistent with Section 2, Subsection 2, Paragraph A. This is also further supported by the principle in Neza and Zamri, where the Sultan was constitutionally entitled to rely on these statutory declarations as the extrinsic evidence of loss of confidence. Once the majority support was lost, Haji Rafa then was no longer eligible to continue holding the office of Menteri Besar. So, Haji Rafa's argument that he remained Menteri Besar simply because he had not resigned or been formally dismissed by the Sultan is irrelevant, since the moment that majority confidence is lost, the office is effectively vacated for the purpose of a new appointment. In conclusion, Haji Rafa has ceased to command the confidence of the majority of the members of SLA by the 8 statutory declarations and withdrawing support to his office. Moving on to the second sub-issue, which is whether Haji Rafa could be dismissed from office or whether his office was deemed vacated even though he refused to resign. This is governed under the Section 2, Subsection 6 of the 8th Schedule. Under this provision, once the Menteri Besar ceases to command the confidence of the majority of the Legislative Assembly, he is required to tender the resignation of the Executive Council unless the Sultan grants his request for the dissolution of the Assembly. So the position of the law is clear that resignation is mandatory and it is not optional. So once majority confidence is lost, he has to tender his resignation. This also must be read together with Section 1, Subsection 2 of the 8th Schedule, which gives the Sultan discretionary power, including the power to appoint a Menteri Besar and the power to withhold consent to a request for dissolution. In other words, while the Menteri Besar may request dissolution, the final decision rests entirely with the Sultan. It is also explained in the previous case of the case of Datuk Sri Niza and Datuk Sri Zamri, where the court held that where a Menteri Besar has lost majority confidence and his request for dissolution is refused, he must resign. If he refuses to do so, then the office is deemed vacated and the Sultan is constitutionally entitled to appoint a new Menteri Besar. By applying this to the present facts, Haji Rafah had clearly lost the confidence of the majority on 23rd December when the 8 assemblymen had submitted the statutory declarations which are with the support. While on 25th December, Haji Rafah then attempted to request for a dissolution of the assembly, but this request was not granted when he was denied entry to the palace due to the public holiday. So it can be understood that the loss of confidence itself had already occurred on the 23rd, and the constitutional consequences will be based from that fact and not from palace office hours. In fact, by attempting to seek dissolution, Haji Rafah had indirectly acknowledged the possibility that he no longer commanded majority confidence. So once the request failed by virtue of Section 2, Subsection 6, it is a mandatory duty on him to resign, and even with his refusal, the office will still be deemed vacated. And as established in Niza and Zamri, once a Menteri Besar refuses to resign after losing confidence and failing to obtain dissolution, the office is automatically deemed vacated. Therefore, Haji Rafah's claim that he remains rightful Menteri Besar simply because he neither resigned nor was formally dismissed is legally untenable. In conclusion, even though Haji Rafah did not formally resign, his office was deemed vacated once he lost the confidence of the majority and failed to secure a dissolution of the assembly. So, to answer back the main issue, whether Haji Rafah's dismissal of his office as the Menteri Besar was constitutionally valid, the dismissal of Haji Rafah as Menteri Besar is constitutional since it was proven that he had lost the majority of confidence and his request for dissolution of the assembly to the Sultan failed.
So moving on to the second main issue, which is whether the appointment of Mr. Alvis as the new Menteri Besar is valid and constitutional. So why we need to discuss whether Mr. Alvis has commanded the majority of confidence, because the majority of confidence is one of the main requirements for the position of Chief Minister. So in Section 2, Clause 2, Paragraph A of the 8th Schedule, it is stated that the ruler shall appoint as Menteri Besar a member of the Assembly who, in his judgment, is likely to command the majority of the members of the party. And how do we need to prove whether he commanded the majority of confidence? There is so many ways to prove, which is statutory declarations, a formal vote, and so on and so forth. In Datuk Sri Niza Jamaluddin and Datuk Sri Zamri Abdul Qadir, it is stated that confidence is a matter of fact and it is not limited to a formal vote. So statutory declarations also may be relied upon, and also relevant to prove there is a majority of confidence from the members of State Legislative Assembly. So in this case, 8 assemblymen withdrew their support from Haji Rafah, which means Haji Rafah has lost the confidence of the majority, as discussed from Aisha earlier. And Mr. Alvis was supported by 5 Unity Party members, 1 Honest Party member, and also the 3 defectors, or the 3 members who was dismissed from RP party. This makes 9 out of 15 members, which constitute as a simple majority. So based on this precedent, the Sultan was entitled to rely on statutory declarations, because statutory declarations is indeed the relevant source to prove or the relevant evidence to prove that the majority of confidence has been commanded. Therefore, Mr. Alvis did command majority confidence at the time of his appointment, satisfying the constitutional requirement. However, Haji Rafah might argue that the 3 support from the 3 assemblymen who was dismissed or who was withdrawn from their party will not be valid, or is not valid and not relevant. However, in Section 7A, Clause 3 of the 8th Schedule, a seat only becomes vacant when the Speaker establishes the vacancy and notify the Election Commission. And in the case of Dewan Undangan Negeri Kelantan and Nordin Saleh, 1992, the disqualification must strictly follow the constitutional procedure and not based on the parties. And in the case of Musa Ahmad and Shafiq Abdal, the withdrawal of support through statutory declarations can establish loss of confidence. Status of the members of the State Legislative Assembly cannot be determined by the parties, but must follow the constitutional procedures, which will be notified by the speakers. So in this case, RP President announced the cessation of membership on 24 December, but this did not automatically vacate the seats, because the speaker need to declare the 3 seats vacant, which the speaker did only at 4 p.m. on 26 December. So Mr. Elvis, however, had already been sworn in, or had already been appointed as the new chief member at 6 a.m. that day, which means before the dismissal of the 3 assemblymen. So at the material time, the 3 defectors, or the 3 dismissed assemblymen, were still the lawful members, and their support was valid and indeed can be counted as the majority. So the validity of so we need to stress that the validity of Executive Act must be assessed based on facts at the time of performance, and the subsequent events cannot be considered, because the law operates retrospectively and it invalidates lawful decisions before the time of the event. So as conclusion, the speaker's later declaration did not affect Mr. Elvis' appointment, and the support of the 3 assemblymen indeed can be counted as the majority of support. Okay, so moving on to the third sub-issue, which is whether the ruler's discretion in appointing Mr. Elvis is constitutional and whether it is absolute. So in section 1, clause 2, paragraph A of the Act schedule, the ruler may act in his discretion in appointing a Menteri Besar. It is in his discretion. However, it must be read together in section 2, clause 2, paragraph A, where it is stated that this discretion must align with the majority confidence, which means the ruler's discretion must act on advice or the requirements stated in section 2, which is the majority confidence. In Stephen Kaloningkan and the Government of Malaysia, discretion is not absolute, and it must follow the constitutional procedures outlined in the Constitution or the court. So in this case, although Haji Rafah had not resigned or been formally dismissed, he had lost the majority of confidence, and the Sultan's discretion was exercised within constitutional limits, which means it is not based solely on his discretion, but he also considered the majority support. This is aligned with the constitutional monarchy concept, which discretion is bounded by law and democratic principles and not absolute power, which means the monarch must follow the constitution set out and the law set out in the constitution. So as a conclusion, the Sultan's discretion was validly exercised, and Mr. Elvis' appointment complied with constitutional principles. Although discretion is not absolute, however, the Sultan indeed followed the correct discretion and followed the procedures outlined in constitution. So based on these sub-issues, we can determine the final status of Mr. Elvis' appointment, whether he indeed had been appointed constitutionally and validly. So in this case, we can conclude that Haji Rafah had lost the majority of confidence on 23rd December when 8 assemblymen withdrew their support and by sending the statutory declarations, and he neither resigned nor successfully obtained the dissolution of the assembly outlined by the constitution because of the public holiday. And Mr. Elvis has commanded 9 votes, which is a clear majority, and has fulfilled the requirements of the position of the chief minister. The 3 defectors were still lawful members until the speaker's declaration later that day, so their support to the Mr. Elvis was valid. Therefore, Mr. Elvis' appointment was constitutional, valid and lawful. And Haji Rafah cannot claim to remain the rightful Menteri Besar, and he has no choice but to dismiss or to withdraw from his position. So in conclusion, dismissal of Haji Rafah was constitutional since he had lost the majority of confidence, and his request for dissolution was not granted because of the public holiday. And the appointment of Mr. Elvis was valid, lawful, and in line with constitutional principles. Thank you for listening.